Welcome, and this video is my first on this channel, so thank you for checking this out. Hopefully this video will work for you and help you build a header component, because that's what we're going to focus on in this video here. Now, I do have a whole bunch of different component videos planned, so this is just the first of a handful of component videos. And in the comments, if there's a specific type of component that you'd like to see built, feel free to let me know, and then I'll take a look at maybe building that component in this channel as well. Now, you might be asking, what is a component? Maybe you're brand new to Power Apps, so you've never used components before. Think of it as like the motherboard on your computer. When you go and build a computer, you don't get a whole bunch of resistors and transistors and try to put everything together. You go buy a motherboard, or maybe you buy a video card. Those are essentially components. They're ready-made, customizable in some cases, maybe not a motherboard or a video card, but you can customize it to a certain amount and then reuse it across multiple different apps in the case of a Power App component. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about components is essentially you're going to get that Lego block and you're going to build it so that everybody that does Power App development can use your custom component or just save yourself a whole bunch of time. Think about it in terms of a header. Every single screen might have a header on it. Having this component built allows you to just insert one component, adjust a couple settings, and then you're done. So it takes away from the screen complexity. If you didn't know it, Microsoft assigns a score of 300 as kind of their max on screen complexity. Not a lot of information out there about what goes into that score, but it's basically the number of different objects you've got on that screen, formulas, and how everything kind of interacts, and they determine a complexity score. I've had some screens as high as 1100, and components really bring the complexity down. You've got one component versus maybe 50 different objects, text boxes, labels, and toggles, and everything else. So you can kind of build a component that does a whole bunch of stuff. So that's what you get with a component library. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, you might be wondering, where do you go to build a component library? Do I just create a new app, or what do I do? So you come down here to More, and you're not going to see component libraries here, so we're going to hit the Discover All. And we're going to scroll down and you're going to see component libraries right here. Now, I recommend pinning this over on the bar over here so that you've got it available from that point on. All right, let's go ahead and click on component library. And I don't have any, so we're going to go ahead and create a new one. And we're not going to do anything crazy. We're just going to call it a component library and hit the create button. Very simple and effective way of naming things is just call it what it is. Now, you might have a component library for different uses, maybe different purposes. Maybe you don't want to have all your components in one component library. So you can have a whole bunch of different naming conventions. Here's something to be aware of with component libraries. Now, I mentioned in the case of an app header, it's on every single screen. So imagine you have an app with 100 screens. Whenever you make a change to the component library, it has to refresh all 100 screens of every instance of a component. So maybe you've got a whole bunch of different components on here. It has to update every single one of those screens because it's got an app header on it, or maybe it's got a navigation bar on it, or maybe it's got some other component. Sometimes when you have a whole bunch of screens that have a component, you might not want to put a lot of components in that component library, especially if you're building them out. So if you're still building a whole bunch of different components, because every time you update that component library, your app is going to have to run that update, and it is going to take a long time. I've had some component library updates take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour to run the update because it's got to update a navigation bar or a header on every single screen that has those things there. So just be aware of that when you're building component libraries. Sometimes having a couple of component libraries is a good thing. Maybe you've got the components that aren't on every single screen. For example, maybe you have like an email component. And there's only typically a couple screens in an app that have that, and maybe you have to do regular updates to kind of redesign it. That might be its own standalone component library where you put a whole bunch of different components into that one. Another thing to be aware of is any media that you bring into your component library is going to be downloaded into every app. So maybe you have some sort of like a spinner component where you created a whole bunch of different types of spinners, different colors to match different design themes. All of those spinners would be downloaded into the app in the case of maybe you've got a GIF or whatever the image that you're putting in there. So just be aware of that is whatever media you've got in there, it is going to be downloaded into that app. So maybe if you've got components that have a whole bunch of media, you want to build those separately because maybe you don't want to bring all that media in every time that you put that component library in an app because maybe you're not going to use spinners inside of that app. So just be aware of that. All right, so what do we want to do when we first get into our component? Let's first take a look at our settings. We want to adjust things. The first thing we're going to come down here is adjust modern controls and themes. We want to turn that on. Then we want to take a look at display settings. I like working in landscape. I don't typically build a lot of apps designed specifically for phones. A lot of times I build them more for a web browser, but most of them will work on both. Just be aware that this design is more for a landscape, tablet, or computer screen. And then we're going to take a look at upcoming features, experimental, and there is one in here for components. And we're going to go ahead and turn that on. Just be aware of whenever you use experimental is sometimes Microsoft isn't done with it. It is experimental. So they are doing different updates and changes. So when you use them, sometimes you'll have to go back into the component or whatever it is and make changes after Microsoft breaks it. Essentially, they do an update. They usually don't tell you that they're going to do the update and then it just stops working. So you'll have to go in here and modify formulas or different properties in order to get everything functioning again. So just be aware of that also and hit the close button here. So we're now done with our initial setup. And let's go ahead and change the name. So every component that we put in here, you're going to put a unique name that's easily identifiable. So we'll just call it app header. And then we're ready to go. Now, let's do a quick orientation now that we've got our basic settings here and take a look at this. Now, as you can see, this is essentially an app. Now, this is really where you're going to test things. So you're going to put everything in here. So if we go up here, we'll see that we've got custom and we've already got the option to add a app header. And you might be saying, well, we didn't do anything. Well, we named it. So essentially we've done something. It's not a lot, but it's a start. So now we could actually add our components. So let's go ahead and do that. And you can see, not much there. It's just a blank screen. But we've now got our first component imported and just kind of testing things out. Now, let's take a look at one other thing up here. So let's go to the insert and just type in header. And you're going to see that we've got a header. So let's click on this and open this up. Now, as you can see, it's got my image. So this is essentially my user logo. And then it's got a image here for like a branding, maybe a company logo. And then you've got the title that you can change. And you've got all these properties over here that you can adjust. The things you can't do is you can't change the image size. You can do a lot of things on here, but there are still a lot of limitations on what you can do. And I don't typically like how small that image is. I want it to be a little bit bigger and I want more control over the image here. And I want to have the option to have buttons. So these are all the things you can't do. You can do a lot. You can change the colors, you can change fonts, you can do different things with this, but you don't necessarily have the same level of control here as what we're going to have in our custom app header. So let's go ahead and delete this here. But this is an option and you can use this. I just prefer having my own custom app header that has the buttons that I typically would use available to me. So let's go ahead and click delete there and go back to the component screen. All right, so what do we want to do here first? Let's go ahead and adjust the width first. So we're going to say app.width. And what this is going to allow us to do is essentially, when we put it inside the app, it's automatically going to fill the entire width of the app, which is great, right? So if we come up here to the screen, we're going to see that our component now fills the entire screen, right? So that's exactly what we're looking for. Now let's go ahead and add a container. Now you might be asking, why are you using a container? You could use a rectangle. And as we see here, we have a rectangle option. You could also use a button. A button is an interesting item because you have a lot of different things you can kind of configure here. The new version allows you to do things a little bit simpler. The classic version of a button, you had to change a lot of different settings in order to use a button. Because I've done app headers with buttons, I've also used the rectangle, and I've also used containers. Now, I prefer containers, so we're going to use containers. The problem with rectangles is you don't have the same level of customization that you can do inside of a container or a button. The problem with the button is you've got almost too much that you can do. And a lot of the stuff just doesn't make sense from a header where you're not clicking on it, because buttons actually include a little bit of extra flexibility where you click on them. And in the classic one, it was always a pain because you had to adjust like 8 different things in order for it to make sense, versus just using a container where it was pretty much ready to go right off the bat. So just that's my logic for why I would use a container over, say, a button or a rectangle. Now, you might be asking the question of, in terms of container, which one, right? So headers go left to right typically. Well, That's essentially what this means is it's going to fill left to right, or basically, right to left to right. That's essentially how we're going to fill this container is it's going to load that way versus a vertical container where things are stacking on top of each other. And then you've got your just blank container here. For this case, because pretty much everything is going to go left to right or right to left, the horizontal container makes the most sense for this design. So let's go ahead and use that. And we'll go ahead and bring this up to the top here. And then we're going to go ahead and make some adjustments here. So the gap is essentially what we're going to have as distance between each item within this container. And I usually go with 10 to 15. In this case, we're going to go with 10 because you might want to add a whole bunch of stuff inside of your header. So 10 is a pretty good number. 5 is a little small. You get a little tight where things are kind of almost bumping up against each other. So 10 gives you a decent amount of distance between each button or each object that's in here. So that's a good place to start, is right there. Then we want to go ahead and adjust our left padding. Now the padding is essentially the distance from the left edge of this container where we want things to start. And we want that to be at 30 is essentially what we're going to say here. Now we're going to go ahead and add a bunch of custom properties. And if you've never used a component before, something to be aware of is sometimes these are kind of a pain to reorder. It will let you reorder them, but a lot of times after you've brought it into your app, it won't match the order that you set. So it is important to try to get this as close as possible. You might find that if you try to reorder things, it won't let you later on. So just kind of be aware of that. But let's go ahead and add a couple of custom properties. Now the first one we want to do is our component height. So how high do we want this component to be? So basically the height here of the component. Now this is the container and we're specifically talking about the component here. So the entire component. Descriptions aren't required. You don't have to put that in there if you don't want to. I usually leave mine blank unless I think that there's some confusion over what I'm talking about. Component height is pretty obvious what we're talking about, so we'll go ahead and change this to number. And then we've got our first property ready to go. Now let's go ahead and add a couple more properties here. So let's do our X value for the header. So we'll say header X, and then again, this will be a number. Now, what are we saying when we say header X? Essentially, we have our component. Well, where does the header going to begin? Do we want this at 0 or do we want it at 30? Where do we want this header, the actual visual portion of the header within the component, to begin? And we're going to go ahead and hit the create button there. And then we're going to do the header width. We have to make that as well. So let's go ahead and create a header width. So how wide do we want that header to be inside of that component? And again, that'll be a number. So we'll get the create button. And then we'll go ahead and set some component values here. So let's go ahead and click on the entire thing here. And we want to set our component height. So instead of 640, we're going to say app header dot component height. And let's go ahead and set that to 70 for this. So we'll say it's 70. All right, there we go. Now we've got this here. And again, here we've got our container. So let's go ahead and set the height of the container. And we're going to set it the same way. So we'll say app header dot component height. And that'll be how tall essentially our container is. Now, what do we want our header X? So basically, where do we want the container to begin? And let's go ahead and click on our X here and set that to the app header dot header X. Now, right now it's set at 100. Pretty much everything's default is 100. Let's go ahead and set the header X to 0. So it begins at the very beginning of our container. All right, now we want to take a look at our header width. Now, what do we want our header width to be? So if we take a look at this, what we want it to be is essentially the app.width, which is the entire width, but we also want to subtract the header X. So we want to say minus app header dot header X. So whatever that header X is, we want it to be subtracting that. So for example, if we had set it at 10, then we would be over this if we say app.width. So we got to subtract that. But we also want to have a gap over here. So we're going to multiply this by 2. So basically it's going to affect both sides. So let's test this now. So if we go over here and we say header X, let's say we put this at 20. So now we've got 20 space over here and 20 space over here. So we're lined up and centered on our app, which is essentially what we wanted to accomplish. Let's go ahead and change the name of this too. So we're going to call this the header container, just to make it simple. I always forget to name things as I go, but I'm going to try to do a better job of naming things in the beginning when we kind of go through this, rather than having to do the cleanup at the very end of this. All right, let's go ahead and change our header X back to 0. All right, so now we have a header. Oh, we should probably do a couple of adjustments here. So let's go ahead and take away the drop shadow. We don't need that on a header. You can leave it, you can put it back on there. I typically take that off of a header because I'm going to put my header inside of a container on the screen anyway. I'm going to let that container be the drop shadow if I want it or not. And we also don't want a border radius. Let's go ahead and change that to 0 for right now. And let's actually make a component value. So let's go ahead and create a custom property for that value. So we'll say header border radius. And that'll be a number value again. So take a look at putting that in there and hit the create button there. So now we've got a header border radius. We definitely don't want that to be 100. Let's just set it at, let's do 50 for right now, and we'll kind of see what this does. So if we click on this here, so the container is essentially our header, and we click on the border radius, let's go ahead and set this in here. So we'll say app header dot header border radius, and there we go. So we've got a little bit right there, as we saw there, that it's curved. And it's hard to see right now, but we're going to change the color of this, and then it'll be a little bit more obvious here in a few seconds. So let's go ahead and create that value as well. So we'll say header color. And this one's not a number, so we got to come down here and select a color and hit the create button. All right, so if we click on header color, let's go ahead and change this color. And for the color, let's go with 20, 109, 177, and 1. And we'll do that color there. This is a color I use quite a bit on my apps. Let's go ahead and set the color here of the background to that color. So we'll say app header dot header color. And there we go. Oh, we can see there's an issue here. So when we select our container, you can see that we've got a border radius and it says multiple. Unfortunately, when you select this, it doesn't actually change everything. So let's go ahead and copy this. All right, let's go ahead and look up radius and let's change this. So we'll just paste it in there. And there we go. Now we can see what happens when we created that border radius and the color. Now, the benefit of this is, let's go back to our screen here for a second. Now we can change the height. So if, let's say we wanted this to be 100, now we can adjust the height very easily by just changing the numbers here. Maybe we want the header X to be 20. So let's go ahead and do, well, 23, I guess. And you can see that it basically puts it further into the screen and centers it for us. Let's go back to 0. And you say, well, that kind of looks funny. Well, maybe we don't want to have a border radius. So let's set that at 0. And now we've got a square. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And then maybe we don't like this color, so we can kind of change it to this color. And it's very easy to adjust based off of whatever you're looking for. So this is the benefit of creating your own custom headers, is now we've got essentially a very adjustable top here. Now you could say, well, you could do that with the other one. That's true, but we're about to add a whole bunch of functions to this header that you can't do with the other ones. Let's go back to the components here. And inside the component, let's move on to adding some other things here. So let's add an image. So let's add and search for image. And you can see, again, it's way bigger than is necessary. Let's go ahead and adjust some of these settings here. Let's take a look at the height. And for the height, we just want it to match our component. So we're just going to say app header dot component height. And then we've got the same height as our component, because we want to kind of maximize and use all the available space here. And you might be saying, why is it in? Well, so when we set that padding on the left, that's what we were doing, is we were saying we don't want it to take any of this rounded area in case we wanted to have this kind of a rounded style. We don't want it to overlap on the part that isn't round. So we've set this essentially the distance that we need to move it in so that we can do this without having to adjust things later on. So that's what we did when we did the padding on the left here. So if we take a look here, you'll see here we got the padding on the left, the 30. That's essentially what creates that. All right, now we want to go ahead and create some more properties for the image. So we want to call this logo image. So we'll call that logo image, and our data type is going to be an image file, and we'll go ahead and create this. And then we can go ahead and select this. And up here, we'll say app.header.logo image. Now, we don't currently have one, so it's going to be just blank. It doesn't really matter right now. We're just building some of these properties. And we want to make another property here for the image width, because we want to be able to customize how wide this is. Some images might be a little bit differently designed, so you want to maximize it as much as you can. So you're going to increase the width, and that's what we're going to do here. So we'll say logo image width, and we'll set that at a number and hit the create button. All right, now let's go ahead and change the width here. So we'll go ahead and select this and then select the width. And we're going to say app.header.image width right there. All right, so now we can adjust this later on inside of our app by making it wider to match the image so that we can kind of maximize the image essentially, or the available space. All right, perfect. So we've got essentially our brand. Let's go ahead and add a text box. So let's come up here, and this might be the screen name, for example. So let's go ahead and put text box in here, and this is the preview one. So this is going to use the styling theme basically from your app, which is great. So we'll go ahead and use that in there. All right, so now we want to think of all the different things that we want to set for this. Now, maybe you want to set the font, maybe you want to set the color, maybe you want to set the font size. Basically, any of the different settings here for the text box. So if we select this and then we get rid of all of this can be set through properties if you need to. It just depends on how customizable you want things to be when you're building this app. Let's go ahead and add some properties in here though. So what are the first things we want to add? Let's go ahead and add the font size. That's kind of a key one there. So we'll go ahead and call this the header title font size. And this is again a number. So let's go ahead and hit the create button there. Now this one we're going to have to adjust. We don't want it to be 100. We'll just say 26 to begin with for that value there. And then we can go ahead and add the next property, which is going to be the title width. So we're going to have this called the header title width. And again, that'll be the number. That'll essentially set this to how wide we want this within here. Basically, maybe we have longer text and we'll want to adjust it, or shorter text and we'll want to adjust that. So you have the flexibility to kind of adjust how big this is. All right, so now we can go ahead and start setting some of these properties. So what do we want to set first? How about we set the height? So we want this to be essentially the container height. So we'll say app header component height, and there we go. And then we want to set the font size. So let's go ahead and change that. So we'll say app header dot header title font size. And there we go. So we can see we've got a lot bigger text now. And then we also want to add a color. So let's go ahead and do that. So we want to call this the header title color, because even black doesn't stand out that good on this blue background that we've got here. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll select a color and hit the create button here. And we're going to go ahead and set this to basically white. So 255, 255, 255, and that'll get us white. And then let's go ahead and change the color here. So we'll click here and go app header dot header title color right there. And now we've got white text. All right, let's go ahead and adjust the width now. So we'll say here and app header dot title width. All right, perfect. Now let's go ahead and adjust the width a little bit. Let's go ahead and make this, I don't know, 350 to begin with, and not 1,000, not 10,000, so 350. And there we go. Now we've got a little bit more width to work with. Now, how do we set the text for this? Well, we got to add another property. So let's go ahead and say header title text. Now this one needs to be different, so we're going to go with function. You don't necessarily need to do this. You could just type it in the box, but a lot of times you want it to match a variable. So if you want to use variables inside of it, you're going to want to use the function. You can use text or function within the app, so it's better to just use the function to begin with. And we'll go ahead and hit the create button there. And then we've got the header title function, which we can now adjust. Let's go ahead and set the text here. And missed it. Here we go. Okay, so app header, header, and title text. And because it's a function, we have to add this. So there we go. All right, so let's demonstrate this. Let's go back to the screen here, and let's go ahead and add a value. So we'll say start screen. And there you go. Now, if you had a local variable or a global variable based off of a record, you could also set this now because we've used the function based off of that. So maybe it's like global record name, and you could set that in here, and that would essentially fill that space with the name based off of that global record. So that's why we set that as a function, so that you can use capabilities like that, or you can just type it in the box. Either one does work. All right, let's go back to the component here. And now we've got a logo here, and we've got this here. Maybe you have the question of, well, what's this going to look like as far as this logo? Go back to the screen here just so we can kind of demonstrate that as well. So we've got this logo image, all right? And right now, I don't have any. So let's go ahead and look at stock images, and we'll select this one and hit the insert button. And there we go. And now we've got an image in there. Now you could have also set it from an upload. Maybe you've got a brand, you can also upload it, and you would essentially set that there. So that's how you can use essentially any image as your brand. So depending on which app, maybe each app has a different logo that you put in there, and you can adjust it in every single app as you go through. Even more so, you could actually change it from screen to screen. So you can actually adjust it even within the same app, going through every single screen. So a lot of flexibility with how we're designing this app to work. Very similar flexibility to how the app header works. So you can do a lot of the same things, but that's about to end here in just a few seconds. So let's go back to components. All right, so now that we've done that, now we want to have the ability to add some buttons. So what do we do for adding buttons? Here again, we're going to add a container. So let's go ahead and insert a container. So again, we're going to use a horizontal container because we want the buttons to essentially go left or right here. And we'll add this container. Now for containers, a lot of times I like to set the mins and maxes. So in this case, we're going to set the min at 1 and the minimum width also to 1 here. That way, if there's an issue where there's not enough space, it can get smaller if necessary, and it's not stuck at a certain length. But when it comes to the flexible width, we're actually going to set this to no. We're going to go ahead and turn this off, and we're going to set a minimum width. Now we're going to add a total of 6 buttons, and each button we're going to set to a width of 40, and we're going to have a gap of 10 in here. So what we're going to set this width to here is going to be 300 based off of those dimensions. And again, you could also adjust this if you have more buttons. That's essentially the formula for this, is whatever the width of your buttons is plus whatever the gap is. And in the case of this container, we're going to set the gap to 10 so that every button is spaced out by 10. And there we go. But we again don't want this, so we're going to turn this to none because this is all inside of our header essentially. We don't want the lines to be visible, so we're going to set that to none. And then we're going to set this to 0 here. And then we've got essentially no lines visible and it's not rounded. So we can add all of our different buttons to it very easily. All right, so let's go ahead and select our container here. And we want to set our height. So let's go here and we're going to set our height to the component height. So we're going to do app header component height, so that we've essentially set exactly what this is supposed to be height-wise. Now let's go ahead and add some buttons. So if we come back over here, let's go ahead and insert a button. And the first one we're going to do is the save button. So let's look at the save. Now you can adjust the order. I'm going to show you this order, but you could do this in a completely different order. Again, we're going to add 6 buttons in total as we go through this. Now that's our first button, and it doesn't look like the way we want it to be, so let's go ahead and adjust some properties. Now you might want to add a whole bunch of different custom properties in here. It just depends on, again, what do you want to configure for the button. Maybe you want a certain on-click color or a fill color. You can adjust every single thing through the properties. It does tend to get a little bit more complicated the more things you put in there because there's a lot of different settings that you can adjust. So I try to limit to the ones that are essential when you're putting it from app to app. And most of the time, these are the ones that you're going to have to take a look at that I'm covering in this video here. All right, so let's go ahead and add a custom property here. So let's go ahead and do button width. And again, that'll be a number. So let's select that and hit the create. Now we also want to change the button color. Let's add that custom property. So we'll say button color and go ahead and select the color option here. All right, so for the button width, we don't want it to be a default of 100. Let's go ahead and select 40 there. All right, let's go ahead and change the color here. So let's select the color here. And we don't want it to be that color, so we'll select it and we'll put it as the button color there. And then we want our width to be the property that we created also. So let's go ahead and do that. Dot button width. Perfect. Now that looks a lot better. Now the width is what can control essentially how big the button is, because it's going to be centered here once we set the height. So let's go ahead and set our height to the container. So it's going to be app header dot component height. So now the height will always match whatever our component is. So if our component gets taller, this will get bigger as well. But the button won't necessarily get bigger because of the width being set. All right, so we've got our first button created. Let's go ahead and rename this the button container. And then we'll call this one the save button. And there we go. Now we can go ahead and copy this because a lot of the settings are already there. So we can hit copy and then paste this 6 times. And there we go. So now this one, we'll call this one the edit button. So we'll say this one's going to be the edit button. And then this one is going to be the add button. And this one is going to be the sort button. And there we go. And this one is going to be our reload or refresh button. And then this one right here is going to be our back button. Now, again, you can put them in completely different order, whatever order makes the most sense for you. Go ahead and do that. And for the back, we're just going to say left. So we'll use this button here as our back button. All right, so now we've got a save, an edit, an add, a sort, a refresh or reload, and a back. And let's go ahead and change the name. So these are going to be ICO edit, IC add, and this one will be our ICO sort. And here we'll use the refresh. I will keep it the same, reload. And then we'll go to back. All right, there we go. So we've got 6 buttons. But what if you don't want all 6 buttons every single time you load it in there? Well, then we have to add properties for that. And then we also have to add properties for what happens when you click these buttons. So we're going to add a whole bunch of different properties right now. And I always group them together. So the first one's going to be your visibility. So we'll go ahead and do the save visibility. All right, and we'll copy this so that we can paste it on the next one. And for this one, it's going to be a Boolean. So we're going to use a true false for this. So let's create that one. And then we want to do the edit button. So we'll go ahead and paste that in there and we'll call it edit. And again, it's going to be a Boolean. So we'll create that. And then we're going to do the add button. Click add. And again, it's a Boolean value. So create that. And then we want to do the sort. And make sure we check this again, hit create. And then we do the refresh or the reload. So we'll call it reload. Then we'll do a Boolean again and hit create. And then finally, we've got the back button. So we'll say back and a Boolean. All right, so we now have all of our visibilities. All right, so now let's go ahead and do the OnSelects here. So we'll go ahead and do our save, and it'll be OnSelect. And this one's a little bit different. It's going to be a event, and we'll go ahead and set it to text. And let's go ahead and click this so we can use that again. And then we'll create each one of these. So again, edit, and we want it to be an event, and create. And then we'll go ahead and create the next one. Let's add, and again, it'll be an event, and text, hit create, and go ahead and create the sort on select. And that'll be also an event. So we'll click event and create. And let's go ahead and reload on select, event, text, and create. And finally, we want to do the back button. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say back. and it's an event, and create. All right, so now we got to set everything. So let's go ahead and click here, and we'll do the visibility first. So that'll be app header dot save visibility. Now let's go ahead and copy that, and we'll go here and change visibility. So we can do that. Now we got edit, we have the add, and then we got the sort. All right, now thanks to the miracle of editing, we are done with changing the visibilities for all of these. Now let's go ahead and do the on selects. So if we come over here, we'll take a look at the on selects for each of these. And then again, it'll be app header dot save on select. And then we'll go ahead and select this so that we can copy it for each one of these. And again, edit each one of these for the function that we're putting on there. All right, now we've gone and updated all of our on selects. Let's go check out the screen and see how this works. So if we come back here, we've got all of these now visible. So let's hit the save button and see what happens. So let's change this, and the save button is gone. And let's go ahead and hit the edit visibility, and it's gone. And here, and here, and here, and here. So we've now got the ability to turn on these buttons or turn them off based off whether we need them on the screen that we're working on. So it's a great functionality there. Now we can also adjust what happens. So if we hit the save button here, we'll have the option of adjusting this. For example, maybe the back button, let's go ahead and type in back here. And now we could go back to a different screen should this be on a different screen. Now in this case, we only have one screen, so let's go ahead and insert a new screen. So we'll just duplicate this screen here. That way we've got everything kind of ready to go. And we need to have a way to get the next screen. So let's go back to the first one. We'll insert a button, put this here, and the on select will be navigate to screen 1-1. And we'll go ahead and add a transition. And there we go. All right, so if we hit play on this app, we can go to the next screen. And we're on the start screen, and we can hit the back, and you can see that everything is working as it's supposed to. All right, so let's cancel this, and then we'll go back to our components. All right, so now we've got our image, our text option here, and we've got the buttons. And the next thing we want to do is take a look at the username and an image, because remember in our example we have the image option there, so we definitely want to have that. Now we want to be able to add our username. So let's go ahead back up here, and then we're going to add a username property. Go ahead, username, and this one's going to be a function, so we'll go ahead and select that and hit the create button here. And then we want to have the user image, so let's go ahead and add another one for an image property here, and this will be the user image. And this one will select the image property and hit the create button. All right, so let's go ahead and select this, and the image for this one is going to be user image. And then we're going to change this. So instead of that, it is going to be username. And then we want to go ahead and change the color for this. So let's go ahead and select the font color. And the color should be good because we just copied the title from here. But we do want to change the header font size. So let's select that. And we're going to change this to user font size. And there we go. Now we do need to adjust the font size because I think right now it's set at 100. So we'll go ahead and select this, and we'll go with, I don't know, 20 to begin with. That'd probably be a good start. Now let's go ahead and adjust this. It's currently starting in the beginning. We want it to be at the end here. So we can see we have text. And then we also need to adjust our width here because we want it to be flexible width. So we want to make sure we turn that on so that this isn't 350 as the example there was. And then let's take a look at this. Now there's a whole bunch of different image settings we can take a look at. So let's go ahead and adjust our image a little bit here. Now in the case of the image, we want to do the width and the height. And we want to set those to essentially match our app. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And we got component height, but what we want to do here is we want to subtract 10. We don't want it to be all the way to the edge, and we'll just copy this to make it easier on ourselves. And we'll go to the width here, and we'll adjust this also. And this one there, and there we go. Now, we want to make sure it's centered, so we got to take a look at our settings for this container. We come up here, we want it to be vertically aligned in the center. So there we go. Now everything's aligned in the center. So we've got a little bit of gap at the top and a little bit of gap at the bottom. So what we can also do is if we don't want to have square, maybe we want to have a round. So we want to match essentially the app header that comes with Power Apps. Let's go ahead and select this image here. And then we're going to go to the radius option here. So let's change this. And it's going to be basically the same thing we just did, except for it's not going to have the subtraction there. So we'll just put that in all 4 of these. And then we're going to get a circle. And there we go. So now when we add the image, we're going to see that in there. All right, let's go ahead and close this out of there. Now, one of the other things we want to take a look at is our border styles. I don't particularly like having border styles, so I like to go and select these as none. And that'll apply for all of our buttons. I don't like the solid look when you click a button, so I always try to set these to none there. And then we'll do the same thing over here for the border style. All right, there we go. Now let's go back to our screen. So now here we have our image, and our image is going to populate in there. So if we wanted to put our image in this component here, let's go down here and take a look at our user image. And on our user image, we're going to say a formula. And in this case, we're going to say user.image. And there we go. Now we have our logo. Now I can also adjust the username. So if I come down here, I could just type it in the box. So maybe I want to put Travis. And there we go. I could also do is welcome, Travis. And there you've got our welcome message. Now, if it starts to get John Doe, and we're going to go to a second level of text. So you do want to make sure you size this off based off of some of the lengths in your organization. Christopher is always a good name to put in there. I have Christopher and then an equally lengthy long last name. And then you can kind of see, is this the right font size? Because what you want to do is kind of set those defaults to work, right? So in this case, we've got our defaults for the font size here at 20. Well, 20 might be a little bit big, so maybe we want to drop that down to 18, and then it fits on one line. But again, if they've got longer names, it's just going to go to that second line. So these are the kinds of things you want to take a look at when you come up with your standardized approach for this. But now we've got essentially 6 different buttons that are built into every single one of our component, and your situation might be a little bit different. These are the buttons I most frequently use, so that's why I've got these as kind of my default. I have had situations where I needed other buttons, and in those cases, some of these other buttons are hidden, so I just basically use the space and I put those buttons on there. I don't necessarily rebuild the component to work for every single button contingency that I have in there. I also like the navigation on the left-hand side, so sometimes I won't have buttons up here, or if I'm going through multiple screen navigations, then I'll put the buttons up here to go back to previous screens. So the possibilities are kind of endless when you've got a header bar with buttons, and then you also leverage the left side navigation as well. So just keep that in mind that you might want to do something like that when you build these things out. Now, for the most part, that is it. Now you can obviously come in here and make all the adjustments you need to. Once we hit the save button, this component will be available across all of our apps. So we'll go ahead and hit the save here, and then we'll have our first component library item done of the header. And hopefully you can see the benefits of using something like this over the one that Microsoft provides to you, because you've essentially got the 6 extra buttons plus the visibility controls and the on starts. You still have to add the on starts, but you can actually build those in there also. Back is pretty common, so a lot of times I'll build that right into the component so it's already ready to go for the back function. And then it's just a matter of configuring each of the pages. Now you can also, and this is one of those new things here, is you have to hit the reapply every once in a while. Just hit the reapply and you're done. You can also make it so that you can hide this. So maybe you don't want the username and the image on every single screen. So on a lot of my components, I'll give the flexibility of actually removing that so that you don't have to have it on there. Or same thing here is you could actually hide this side. So you could also do containers for all 3 elements. So you could have the user information container over here, the button container, and then you could also have the title and branding inside of its own container. And then you could also set a visibility for that container. So you essentially hide the entire container as part of that. Keep in mind when you hide an entire container though, everything shifts, especially when you're using a horizontal container. If you wanted to do something like that, you might want to consider not using the horizontal container. but then you don't benefit from some of the benefits of using the horizontal container. So just some things to kind of keep in mind as you're building out these different components. All right, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you found this helpful. And next up, we're going to take a look at creating a navigation element on the left-hand screen. So essentially that left-hand navigation, so if you've ever seen a model-driven app, we're going to do something similar to that. We're actually going to do two different types of navigation on the left side. I use both. One is similar to model-driven, then I have another version that's a little bit more condensed. So I'll show you how to do both of those. All right, until next time.